The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago knelt not before an opponent, not before a weapon, but before a 5-year-old boy who hadn't spoken a word for 243 days. He'd tried everything. 23 experts, $5 million. Every expert gave up. Then a poor, broken woman, bruised and grieving for her daughter, walked through his door, not to save anyone, but to mop the floors. She didn't know she held the only key to unlocking his son's silence. And he didn't know that the woman mopping his marble hallways was about to become the most important person he knew. On this channel, we tell stories of mafia bosses' lives, unimaginable love, and families forged not by blood, but by pain, courage, and the choices they made to hold on. This story will remind you, the deepest wounds are often the gateway to the greatest love. If this touched your heart, please leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and share this with someone who needs to believe in love again.
She had arrived just 3 days after Dominic made the declaration that sent shockwaves through the city's criminal empire. A woman with scars on her back and the quiet resilience of someone who had survived worse than gangsters. Her name was Eleanor Morgan, and she didn't come for the reward of half an empire or a marriage of convenience. She came because she needed a job, any job. She simply did her work, cleaning the marble halls, never intruding on the boy's silent world of perfectly aligned toy cars. She was just a presence, a shadow who understood silence. But it was in that shared silence, a language she learned in the worst of foster homes, that the boy found a strange comfort. It was a stark contrast to the desperate pleas of his father and the probing questions of 23 different doctors. It was this unassuming woman who knew what it was like to lose a child, who unknowingly held the key. The key was forged in Dominic's desperation. On a night that would become legend, he stood before allies and enemies alike and laid his soul bare. "I will give half of my empire," he'd announced, his voice raw, "and marry anyone who makes my son speak again." He thought of his wife, Isabella, whose death 8 months prior had stolen their son's voice. He had no idea the person to answer his plea wouldn't be a world-renowned therapist from Switzerland or Japan, but a 27-year-old applying for a housekeeping job from a grimy corner of Southside Chicago. While he made his earth-shattering offer, Eleanor Morgan was miles away, counting a meager $47.63 in tips, the sum of 9 brutal hours of work. The flickering lights of Mickey's diner cast long shadows on her hollowed cheeks. At 27, she looked closer to 40. That meager $47 was all she had. Rent of $400 was due, and 2 men were waiting for her in a dark alley behind the diner. They were collectors for Tony Marcello, sent to remind her of the $50,000 debt her husband had left her with. They didn't want excuses, they wanted payment. The first blow knocked the wind out of her. The second split her lip, the taste of blood filling her mouth. They slammed her head against a brick wall, promising to start taking payment in other ways if she didn't have the money in 2 months. They left her crumpled on the dirty snow, a piece of trash in a city that had already taken everything from her. She dragged herself home, each step in agony, to a condemned building where the elevator never worked and the radiator offered no warmth. But inside her single, cold room was the one thing that mattered. A cheap plastic frame held a photo of Lily, her little girl with golden curls and a gap-toothed smile. Next to it, a tiny bracelet of pink and purple beads. Holding the picture to her chest, she remembered everything: the foster homes, the abuse, learning that silence was survival. She remembered fighting her way out, getting a degree in American Sign Language, and dedicating her life to helping children find their voices. She remembered Marcus, the man who promised her the world, and then Lily, born with a heart too fragile. The surgery cost $200,000, an impossible sum. Insurance said no. Ellie remembered the monitors flatlining, her screams echoing in a hospital corridor as her 3-year-old died in her arms. That same night, Marcus vanished, leaving only his gambling debts for the loan sharks to collect. That was 2 years ago. As she lay on her mattress, broken and bleeding, her phone buzzed. A job notification she'd forgotten about. Housekeeper needed. Gold Coast estate, high salary, absolute discretion required. The Gold Coast, a world of old money and deep shadows. Ellie looked at the bruises on her arms, then at her daughter's smiling face. It was a choice between dying slowly or dying fast. "At least I'll eat before I go, right, baby girl?" she whispered, and pressed apply. The Castellano estate was more fortress than home. Iron gates, security cameras like blinking red eyes, and manicured gardens where marble statues stood guard. Ellie clutched her purse, feeling every scuff on her sneakers and the cheap cracking foundation covering the yellowing bruise on her cheek. A guard with a face like granite checked her name, Eleanor Morgan, before a female guard patted her down with cold efficiency. She swallowed her pride and followed them down a long cobblestone drive. 117 steps from the gate to the massive front door. She counted to stay calm. Inside was a palace of gleaming marble and crystal chandeliers, but it felt cold, empty. A museum, not a home. There were no family pictures, no laughter etched into the walls, just a sterile beauty. In a sitting room, she met Margaret Crawford, the head housekeeper, a woman with silver hair in a severe bun and eyes that could cut glass. "Sit," Mrs. Crawford commanded, her posture as rigid as a soldier's. This was the place where a father, broken by grief, was willing to trade half his kingdom for a single word from his son. A grief that began 8 months before, when his wife Isabella died, taking their child's voice with her to the grave. And it was into this silent, grieving palace that a woman who had lost her own child, a woman who spoke the language of silence, was about to walk. "If you're hired, your accountability is to me and me alone." She slid a file open. Eleanor Morgan, 27 years old. "Your work history shows stints as a waitress, custodian, and a factory line worker. You have no criminal history, no living family." Ellie tried not to react to that last part, keeping her expression impassive. "Why are you interested in this position?" "I need the income," Ellie stated plainly. Mrs. Crawford's gaze sharpened. "Everyone needs an income. Why this specific job? You're surely aware of the gossip surrounding this estate." "I hear many things," Ellie replied with caution. "I've learned it's best to ignore most of them." A subtle shift occurred in Mrs. Crawford's demeanor, perhaps approval, or simply the lack of disdain. "Very well. Let's cover the rules. First, you are to have zero interaction with the young master. Absolutely none. You will not address him, look at him, or even admit he exists. Is that clear?" Ellie gave a firm nod. "Second, you are forbidden from inquiring about Mr. Castellano's affairs. You will observe things. You will overhear things. You are to immediately purge them from your memory." Another nod. "Third, whatever takes place within these walls stays within these walls. Not a single word to anyone. Not friends, family, law enforcement, or clergy. Break this rule, and the repercussions will be substantial." Mrs. Crawford leaned in closer. "Do you grasp the meaning of substantial in this home, Miss Morgan?" Ellie held her stare. "I do." Mrs. Crawford sized her up for a long beat before rising. "Come with me." The walkthrough lasted nearly an hour, covering 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library, a grand ballroom, a wine cellar, and a full gymnasium. Every room was more opulent than the one before, and all of them felt completely devoid of life. As they moved through the second floor, Mrs. Crawford hurried past a door at the far end of the hall, but it wasn't shut completely. A gap of about 2 inches let a sliver of light spill out, and in that narrow opening, Ellie saw him. A little boy sat on the window seat motionless, hugging a faded teddy bear. He was looking down at the garden, but his gaze was vacant. His eyes were empty, desolate, like looking into a house where every light had been extinguished. Ellie recognized those eyes. She'd seen them in another face a long time ago. In the end, when Lily was too frail to smile, too exhausted to weep, when only the flickering of a dying candle remained. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful constriction. She couldn't draw a breath. "Miss Morgan?" Mrs. Crawford's stern voice jolted her back to the present. Ellie saw that she'd frozen, her hand clutching her chest. "Coming," she managed to whisper. She made herself walk, follow, and inhale. But the vision of the small boy was seared into her memory. She had promised, kneeling in the rain by Lily's grave, that she would never allow her heart to shatter for another child. The sorrow was too great, the emptiness too profound. She had constructed defenses around herself, piece by piece, sealing everything out. Yet, as she looked into those vacant eyes, a reflection of her daughter's in her last moments, Ellie felt the first cracks appear in her fortress. That evening, well after the estate grew quiet, Dominic Castellano's black SUV glided through the main gates. He was in the back, his jaw tight, his knuckles pale against the upholstery. His sit-down with the Moretti clan had been tense. His competitors were like sharks, sensing weakness in the water. His recent public plea had been interpreted as a sign of vulnerability, a fatal flaw in his line of work. Vincent Romano greeted him inside. "We've received 437 replies to your announcement," Vincent said. 90% of them are con artists, fortune tellers, spiritualists, and peddlers of fake cures. He paused. "We also intercepted 6 hired guns pretending to be specialists. They saw the boy as their way in." Dominic paused on the stairs. Were they dealt with? Dealt with. He proceeded up the stairs without further comment. Lucas's room was dimly lit by a nightlight. The boy was in bed, awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Mr. Buttons was snuggled beneath his chin, the bear's button eyes glinting in the faint light. Dominic perched on the bedside. "Hey there, champ. Dad's back." Silence. "Do you recall how you'd pretend to snore whenever I brought up my work? Your mom would just lose it, laughing." His voice wavered. Lucas kept staring into space. Dominic reached over, his fingers brushing his son's cheek. The skin was warm, so alive, but the child inside was missing, lost in a place his father couldn't reach. "Lucas, I just need you to look at me." The boy's gaze stayed on the ceiling, as empty as a foreclosed home. The memories rushed in without warning. Isabella in the kitchen with a dab of flour on her nose, showing Lucas how to flip pancakes. Lucas belting out his little song. "Daddy is strong, Daddy is tall, Daddy will catch me if I fall." Isabella recording it all, her laughter filling the room, her face radiant with joy. Dominic had pledged to keep them safe from everything. But he couldn't shield her from what was inside her. She had collapsed on the kitchen floor right in front of their son. A congenital condition, the physicians explained. A hidden flaw waiting to rupture. By the time Dominic got there, a sheet was being drawn over her face, and Lucas hadn't uttered a sound since. Dominic lifted Mr. Buttons from the bed, pressing the worn toy to his chest. It carried the faint, lingering scent of her perfume. "I let you down, Isabella," he murmured. "I couldn't protect you, and now I'm losing him too." Tears streamed down his face, the most formidable man in Chicago, weeping in the dark while holding a stuffed bear. A quiet knock broke the stillness. Mrs. Crawford was at the door. "Sir, the new housekeeper is settled in." Her background information was spotless, entirely unremarkable. Dominic wiped his eyes. "Good. Ensure she knows the rules." "Yes, sir." She left as quietly as she came. Dominic was unaware that 3 stories down, the unremarkable girl lay on a simple bed, clutching a photo of a little girl with golden hair. He didn't know her tears fell in the same heartbroken rhythm as his. 2 shattered people, grieving in the shadows, unaware that their lives were already being woven into a single thread. In her first week at the Castellano estate, Ellie mastered the art of being invisible. She glided through the mansion silently, constantly tidying, never initiating conversation, always keeping her eyes down and her footprint small. She quickly learned the household's strict routine. Nicole, the nanny, drove Lucas to his therapy sessions at 9 each morning. Dominic was gone before sunrise and returned well after sunset. Mrs. Crawford patrolled the estate like a guard, noticing every detail. And through it all, Lucas moved like a tiny specter, silent and remote. Ellie observed him from a distance, the way he could walk across a room without a sound, the hours he would spend staring at nothing, the way he held on to Mr. Buttons as if it were the only thing keeping him from floating away. She kept telling herself she wasn't invested. This was just a job for the money. Yet every glimpse of those empty eyes made her own heart ache with a familiar sorrow. On a Tuesday afternoon, as Ellie polished the grand staircase railing, she sensed someone was standing behind her. She pivoted. Lucas was there, just a few feet away, just watching her. Her breath hitched. Seeing him this close, he looked even more fragile than she'd thought. His skin was pale, with dark smudges beneath his eyes, and his hair was getting long. He clutched Mr. Buttons tightly, and those dreadful, empty eyes were fixed on her, unblinking. Ellie started to speak, unsure of what to say. "Lucas!" Nicole's sharp voice echoed from the end of the hall. She marched over, took Lucas by the arm, and pulled him back. "What have I told you about wandering off?" Nicole scolded the boy. Then her cold eyes fell on Ellie. "And you are not to interact with him. Ever. Is that clear?" "I was only—" "Understood." Ellie dropped her gaze. "Yes." Nicole led Lucas off, but just before they turned the corner, the boy glanced back at Ellie for a brief instant. Something in his expression made her heart skip a beat. Later, while Ellie was dusting in the main living area, she noticed it, a drawer that hadn't been fully closed. Tucked inside, under a pile of old magazines, was a silver-framed photograph of a woman with dark hair and a warm smile, captured mid-laugh. Ellie's blood ran. For the first time, a flicker of light sparked in the boy's vacant stare. He watched her hands, his head tilting with a sudden, bird-like curiosity. Ellie held her breath, repeating the sign slowly. She had seen it, a brief, beautiful flash of life in his eyes, before it vanished. Just then, a sharp voice cut through the stillness. "Lucas!" The nanny, Nicole, rushed down the hall, her face a mask of fury. "What do you think you're doing?" The moment was shattered. But it had happened. Something had gotten through. This small victory was born from a simple, forbidden act of compassion. She couldn't just walk away. Looking at the little boy standing over his fallen toy, his eyes completely empty, she had to do something. So she had knelt, meeting his gaze, and gently picked up the teddy bear. But instead of just giving it back, she held it in one hand and lifted the other. Her fingers formed a familiar shape, a word she knew by heart. "Friend," she'd whispered softly, making the sign. "This means friend in sign language." The boy's eyes, for the first time, had locked onto her hands. That moment of connection was a stark contrast to the emptiness that had filled the mansion just a day earlier. The specialists were gone, their expensive equipment packed away. Mrs. Crawford was barking orders, and the staff moved like ghosts through their routines. No one dared mention the failed treatment or the sounds of weeping that might have slipped through a bedroom door in the dead of night. Ellie had tried to focus on her work, dusting furniture in the living room, but her thoughts kept returning to the night before. She had seen Dominic on his knees, his powerful frame shaking with sobs that he choked back in the darkness. She knew that kind of grief, the type that lives in secret. A noise had made her turn. It was Lucas, standing in the doorway like a statue. The teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, dangled from his hand until it slipped, landing with a soft thud. The boy just stared at it, making no move at all, as if the effort was simply too much. Ellie looked around. Nicole was gone. She knew she was supposed to keep her distance, to never interact. She had seen the raw despair that drove Dominic to his knees later that night. A despair born from watching a team of the country's finest specialists admit defeat. The mansion had been electric with a tense, fragile hope that morning. Black cars filled the drive, and men and women in sharp suits bustled through the doors. Dr. Samuel Hayes, a man who looked like he'd never known failure, led a team of experts flown in from Boston. A child psychologist, a speech therapist, a neurologist, all of them here for one silent boy. Lucas had been led to the library, now a temporary clinic, dragging his teddy bear behind him like an anchor. For 3 hours, Ellie had cleaned the same section of hallway, listening. She heard calm, professional voices turn strained with frustration. She heard the clatter of instruments and the rustle of paper, the sounds of a methodical assault on a child's fortress of silence. Finally, the doors opened. Dr. Hayes came out first, his confidence gone. The others trailed behind him, their expressions grim. Lucas emerged last, his face a blank slate, his eyes as empty as before. Dominic had appeared, his own eyes alight with a desperate hope. "Well?" he demanded. The doctor couldn't meet his gaze. "Mr. Castellano," he began, "physically, there's nothing wrong with your son." He explained they'd tried everything: cognitive therapy, sensory integration, play therapy. "Give me results," Dominic had snapped. The doctor faltered. "He's built a wall around himself," he finally admitted, "and I'm afraid none of our methods can break through." The silence was deafening. "Get out," Dominic said, his voice dangerously low. As the defeated team scrambled away, Vincent tried to calm him, but Dominic was beyond reason. Just as the specialists fled, a regal woman swept in, her diamonds glittering coldly. "Catherine Castellano." "Dominic," she said, her voice like ice. "Another failure, I see. This announcement of yours has made us a laughingstock. Our enemies smell weakness." His jaw clenched. "You're destroying everything your father built, offering half your empire to any charlatan who claims they can help." Catherine stepped closer, her tone sharp. "You are thinking with your heart, Dominic. Your father never made that mistake." "My father never lost his wife," he shot back, his voice cracking. "I've already lost Isabella. I will not lose Lucas." Hidden in the hallway, Ellie had seen it all. She watched Lucas being led away, a small, exhausted figure. She saw how the experts had treated him like a puzzle to be solved, not a child to be comforted. And she remembered Lily, her own daughter, too weak to speak in her final days, but whose tiny, trembling fingers had still formed the signs Ellie had taught her. "Mama," Lily had signed. "Love." That night, a sound from Lucas's room had pulled her close. It was a soft, broken crying. Peeking through the door, she saw Dominic kneeling by his son's bed, his face buried in the blankets, his shoulders shaking with the sobs of a man who had lost everything. Silently, Ellie had backed away, her own tears finally falling for this family's unspeakable pain. The day she first arrived, she hadn't understood the depth of that pain. She was just cleaning, finding her place in the quiet, oppressive grandeur of the Castellano mansion. Then, in a drawer, she found a photograph in a silver frame. A beautiful woman with tired eyes. It was her, Dr. Isabella Castellano. "What are you doing?" Ellie jumped, spinning around to see Dominic in the doorway, his face a mask of stone. His eyes darted from her face to the picture. "I was cleaning," she stammered, putting the frame back. "That was my wife." The words hung in the air. "I know," Ellie whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. His eyes narrowed. "You knew her?" "No," she lied quickly. "I just saw the resemblance to the boy." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. "Do you have children?" he asked, the question hitting her like a punch. "I did," she managed to say. "Once." Something in his frozen expression shifted. A crack in the ice. "What happened?" "She died." The silence that followed was different. He wasn't looking at her like a servant anymore, but like someone who understood a grief that had no words. She turned and fled, feeling his gaze on her back. What he couldn't know, what she could never tell him, was that she knew his wife's face from the worst night of her life 2 years ago. The night her own daughter, Lily, was dying. A doctor with tired eyes and a gentle voice had knelt beside her. "I am so sorry," Dr. Castellano had said, tears on her own cheeks. "The surgery she needs. The hospital won't approve it without payment. I've tried everything. I can't do anything more." Ellie had hated that woman, had blamed her for Lily's death. And now she was here, in this house of grief, brought together by a shared, unspoken tragedy. The woman who couldn't save her daughter was the mother of the boy she might be able to save. "So you were teaching him sign language," Dominic Castellano stated, his voice a low rumble in the cavernous office. His eyes, dark and unreadable, studied Ellie. "You lied on your application." Ellie's heart pounded, but she met his gaze. "I omitted the truth. I needed the work. My past as a specialist for children with trauma didn't seem relevant for a housekeeping job." She took a shaky breath, the truth her only remaining shield. "I saw he couldn't speak. I wanted to give him a voice." Dominic leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock. He turned to Vincent, his security chief. "Double the guard on her. Eyes on every door. Nobody gets near her without my authorization." "Boss, she's just a—" Vincent began, but Dominic cut him off, his voice like chipping ice. "She's mine, and no one touches what's mine." But this tense summit hadn't materialized from thin air. It was the end of a chain reaction that started just hours before, with a sharp knock on Ellie's door at 9 that night. Two stone-faced guards had escorted her through unfamiliar, opulent wings of the mansion to Dominic's study. The summons was a direct result of Vincent presenting his boss with tablet footage from earlier that week. The video showed a cleaning woman kneeling, making careful motions with her hands toward the boy. "The new housekeeper," Vincent had explained. "Nicole says the boy's been acting strange." That report from Nicole was the key. She had burst into Mrs. Crawford's office in a flurry of urgent whispers, which led to a swift phone call, and it all traced back to a single moment of discovery. Nicole had found her son on his bedroom floor, carefully shaping the sign for friend with his small hands, showing it to his teddy bear, Mr. Buttons. He froze when he saw her, the flicker of life in his eyes instantly extinguished. But she had seen enough. She had already been suspicious, noticing Lucas making odd, deliberate hand gestures for days. What she had stumbled upon was the culmination of a silent, secret correspondence. It had begun with a slip of paper Ellie tucked under Lucas's pillow, a simple drawing of the sign for friend next to the written word. The next day, she found the note with a crayon sketch of a teddy bear added beside it. His way of saying he understood. A hidden conversation unfolded on scraps of paper. Ellie would leave a new drawing, 3 fingers tapping the chin for water. The next day, she'd find his own childish copy of the sign. They exchanged eat, a hand moving to the mouth, sleep, palms pressed together by a tilted head, and happy, a hand brushing upward over the heart. He began adding his own illustrations, a plate of cookies, a sky full of stars, a bright yellow sun. They never saw each other during these exchanges, but an invisible bond of hope was being woven with paper and crayon. And Ellie started to see a change in him during her cleaning rounds. A little less weight on his shoulders, a spark of curiosity in his otherwise vacant stare. The risks she took were fueled by a promise made in the solitude of her tiny room in the servants' quarters. One night, clutching a worn photograph of her daughter Lily, the memories had overwhelmed her. Lily, forever 3 years old, with her golden curls and gap-toothed smile. Lily in the hospital, too frail to talk, her body giving out. But her hands could still move. It had been their secret world, the sign language Ellie had taught her from birth. In those last, heartbreaking days, it was their only connection. "Mama," Lily's trembling fingers had signed. "Love." They were her daughter's final words. Pressing the photo to her heart, tears carving paths down her cheeks, Ellie had whispered to the picture, "Should Mama help that little boy, my sweet girl?" In the deep quiet of her room, she felt an answer, a sense of peace that settled her resolve. She would help Lucas find his voice, the way she had helped Lily. She would risk her job, risk everything, for him. That powerful decision was forged from a single fleeting moment of connection just days earlier, the moment that started it all. "What are you doing?" Nicole had hissed, yanking Lucas away from Ellie in the hallway. The boy's teddy bear fell to the floor. "I was just giving this back to him," Ellie said, rising slowly. "I saw the way you were gesturing with your hands." Nicole's eyes flashed with anger. "I don't know what twisted game you're playing, but I'm reporting you to Mrs. Crawford." She pulled Lucas away, but not before the boy glanced back. His eyes met Ellie's, and in that instant, she saw a reflection of her own past pain. It was the look of a soul trapped behind an invisible wall, screaming to be set free. And she knew she couldn't just walk away. With his hands planted on the desk, Dominic leaned in, his gaze fixed on hers. "Why my son? What is it you want from him?" "Nothing," she replied, her voice trembling. "I saw him drop his bear and just stand there, like he didn't have the strength to lift it. I saw how empty his eyes were." Tears welled up. "I knew that look. I saw it in my own daughter before she passed away." Dominic's expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing for just a second. "Your daughter, Lily," he said, the name a soft whisper. "She was 3, born with a bad heart. We couldn't pay for the surgery." Ellie's voice shattered. "She died right in my arms at the emergency room." A heavy silence filled the office. "The same condition," Dominic murmured, almost to himself. "The same as Isabella." "Yes," Ellie confirmed, dabbing her eyes with shaking fingers. "And there's something else. Your wife was at the hospital that night. She was the doctor who tried to save Lily." Dominic turned ghostly pale. "She couldn't help us," Ellie went on. "The hospital wouldn't do the surgery without the money. But she tried. She really fought for my little girl." Her voice fell to a faint whisper. "She cried when she told me there was nothing else to do. For years, I hated her. I blamed her. But I see now it wasn't her fault. It was the system. It was everything but the woman who cried for my child." Dominic's knuckles went white as he gripped the desk. "Isabella never said a word," he rasped. "She carried so much. So many kids she couldn't save. She never told me." "She was a good person," Ellie said gently. "And her son is still here. He's still fighting, even if he doesn't realize it." Dominic looked up, his eyes filled with anguish. "The specialists say there's no hope, that it's all in his head, that he's built up walls." "He has. But walls can have doors." Ellie stepped forward, her fear forgotten. "Lucas isn't broken, he's just trapped. The trauma has stolen his voice. But sign language, it can give him another way out, a way to show what he can't speak." "How can you be sure this will work?" "Because I taught my daughter to sign when she was too weak to talk." In her final moments, she didn't cry, she smiled. She signed, "Mama loves you," and then she was gone. Tears rolled down Ellie's cheeks. Lucas has so much he needs to say. He just needs someone to show him a different door. For a long moment, Dominic was still. He worked his jaw, his fists clenching and unclenching. Then he stood, walked around the massive desk, and knelt right in front of her. The most powerful man in Chicago's criminal underworld, on his knees before his cleaning lady, his eyes swimming with tears. "Please," he whispered, "save my son." From that night on, everything was different. By the next day, Dominic had given new orders. Ellie was no longer a housekeeper. She was Lucas's personal communications specialist, given a private room in the family wing. Nicole was quietly moved to another property. Mrs. Crawford accepted the news with a tight-lipped stare, but said nothing. Vincent just nodded, his eyes lingering on Ellie with a mix of curiosity and caution. The real explosion was Catherine. She showed up unannounced the following afternoon, her heels echoing angrily on the marble. Ellie could hear the shouting 2 rooms away. "A cleaning woman teaching my grandson?" Catherine's voice was sharp enough to break glass. "Have you lost your mind, Dominic? She's qualified. She scrubs toilets. She also has a degree in sign language and experience with traumatized children." Dominic's voice was unnervingly calm. "Do you have a better idea, Mother? Because 23 specialists have failed. 23 experts with their fancy degrees and high fees couldn't get through to Lucas. She did. This is beneath us. Our family name." "Our family name is worthless if my son stays a ghost." Dominic's voice turned to steel. "This conversation is over." Catherine stormed out moments later. She shot Ellie a venomous look in the hallway, her silence a greater threat than any scream. But Ellie held her ground. She'd faced far worse than a disapproving matriarch. The first official lesson started that afternoon. Lucas sat on the playroom floor, hugging Mr. Buttons to his chest, his eyes watchful and wary, like a cornered animal. Ellie sat across from him, her legs crossed. "Hi, Lucas," she began gently. "Remember the notes we passed? The little drawings?" He didn't answer, but his grip on the bear relaxed a bit. "Today, I want to show you some new signs. Not with paper, but with our hands." She slowly lifted her right hand. "This means water." She made the sign, tapping her chin with 3 fingers. Lucas watched her, his focus absolute. "Want to try?" Nothing happened for a long moment. Then, his small hand rose. His fingers were clumsy, but he tapped his chin. Ellie's heart leaped. "Perfect," she breathed. "That was just perfect." They worked for an hour. Water, eat, sleep, happy, sad. Each sign came more easily than the last. Lucas was like a sponge, his hands gaining confidence, and a flicker of life returned to his eyes. The emptiness was still there, but now a tiny spark fought against it. Outside, Dominic watched through a crack in the door. He saw his son's hands moving with purpose for the first time in 8 months. He saw awareness replace the vacant stare. He saw the shadow of the boy Lucas used to be, reaching out from the silence. Tears streamed down his face, and he didn't wipe them away. That night, with Lucas asleep, Dominic was waiting in the library. "Teach me," he said bluntly. "The signs. I need to learn them. I want to talk to my son." Ellie nodded and motioned for him to sit. She started with the same basics she'd taught Lucas: water, eat, sleep. Dominic's big, rough hands, so used to violence, struggled with the delicate movements. It was almost funny, seeing this feared man fumble with gestures a child had picked up in minutes. But he was determined. "Like this," Ellie said, gently correcting his fingers. "Your thumb touches your chin, not your cheek." Her hand brushed his, and they both froze. The touch was brief, but an unspoken current passed between them. Dominic cleared his throat and made the sign correctly. "Good," Ellie said, pulling her hand away. They practiced in silence for another hour, the air thick with unspoken feelings. Finally, Dominic lowered his hands. "Do you think everyone deserves a chance to be saved?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Ellie met his gaze steadily. "I think everyone deserves to be loved," she replied. "Even a mafia boss." 2 weeks went by in a haze of quiet breakthroughs. Lucas's vocabulary grew from words to short phrases. He could sign for water, point to food, and indicate he was tired. He also started to express feelings. One afternoon, Lucas abruptly stopped their lesson. His small hands formed a sign she'd recently taught him. "Sad," he signed. Then he pointed to a picture of Isabella on a shelf. "You miss Mommy?" Ellie signed back. Lucas nodded, his eyes shining with tears. It was the first time in 8 months he'd acknowledged his mother. Ellie drew him into a hug. and his little body briefly relaxed into hers. The progress was slow and difficult, but it was real. Dominic watched as many sessions as he could, practicing the signs late into the night, his rough hands becoming more graceful. He started joining the lessons, sitting on the floor with Lucas as father and son learned a new language together. And gradually, the evening lessons with Ellie transformed into something more. They would talk long after the signs were put away, about grief, about loss, about the strange turns their lives had taken. The space between them shrank with every conversation. Neither of them had to name what was happening. Just then, the shadows crept back in. Vincent entered Dominic's study one morning, his expression grim. "We've got a problem, boss." Dominic glanced up from his desk. "What is it?" "Someone's been asking about the Morgan woman, checking her old address, her past jobs." Vincent paused. Tony Marcello. The name filled the room. "The loan shark from the South Side," Dominic stated. "Her dead husband owed him $50,000. Marcello's been hunting for her since she vanished." Vincent's jaw was tight. He knows she's working here now. Dominic's face remained a mask, but his eyes were like ice. Grew cold. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Double security around her. I want eyes on every entrance, every exit. No one gets near her without my permission." Vincent nodded, but his curiosity got the better of him. "Boss, she's mine." The words came out sharp as a blade. "No one touches what is mine." Vincent wisely said nothing more. That night, Ellie made a mistake. She left behind a photo of Lily at her old place. Thinking she could slip in and out unnoticed after dark, she took a taxi to the south side. She was wrong. They were waiting inside, the two men who had attacked her before. The place was destroyed, her things in ruins. "Hello again, Eleanor." The larger man grinned, cracking his knuckles. She never even had a chance to scream. Was calculated, savage, and efficient. They were experts at causing immense pain while avoiding marks that would last. 2 weeks. The smaller thug whispered into her ear as she lay defeated on the ground. "Pay what you owe, or we start taking pieces next time." As they were about to go, the larger one noticed a gleam on the floor. It was the small bracelet she had lost in the struggle. A string of pink and purple beads. Lily's bracelet. He scooped it up, inspected it, and then put it in his pocket with a sneer. "A little something for our trouble." They abandoned her there, bruised and bleeding amidst the wreckage of her apartment. Ellie managed to drag herself to the spot where Lily's picture had landed. The photo was ripped in half, her daughter's joyful face torn apart. She clutched the pieces to her chest and sobbed. The bracelet was gone. The last physical piece she had of Lily was gone. She had no idea that Dominic had initiated surveillance on her the second Vincent had given his warning. She didn't realize a camera hidden across the street had recorded the entire assault. And she couldn't know that miles from her, in his private office, Dominic Castellano was viewing the footage, his body shaking with a fury that turned his blood to ice, the iron. The warehouse on Holstead fell silent just past 12 a.m. Inside, 8 men were laughing over cards and cash, completely unaware of the approaching storm. The entire takeover was over in 4 minutes. Dominic's crew operated with a chilling blend of speed and savagery. They were methodical, disabling kneecaps and cracking ribs with practiced ease. They left Tony Marcello a wreck on the cold concrete, pleading for it to end as his men lay groaning around him. His face was a pulp, and he was begging for any kind of mercy he could find. Vincent knelt beside him, dangling a small bracelet of pink and purple beads. "This is the property of someone significant," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Taking it was a poor decision." "I had no idea," Morello choked out. "No idea she was connected." "Well, now you do." Vincent tucked the bracelet away. "Consider the account settled. But if you or your crew ever get near her again, or even whisper her name, we will return. And our next visit won't be this pleasant." He then rose and departed without a backward glance, leaving Marcello sobbing in his own ruin. And it all happened because Dominic Castellano was not a man who forgave. In his study, under the weight of a heavy Chicago night, he had replayed the security feed for a third time. His jaw was a knot of pure steel. He saw Ellie fall, saw the boot connect, saw one of the thugs snatch the little bracelet and laugh. A switch flipped inside him. He grabbed his phone. "Vincent, assemble the team." 20 minutes later, his 6 most loyal men were in the basement. His command was simple and cold as ice. "Don't kill him, but make sure he remembers this night for the rest of his miserable life." He was waiting for her in his study when she was summoned, turning from the window as she walked in. His gaze took in every mark on her face, a silent, furious inventory. Without a word, he crossed the space between them and held out a small velvet box. "Open it." Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Nestled on the silk was her daughter's bracelet, a little worn, but perfectly intact. A choked sob escaped her lips. "But how did you?" "Nobody lays a hand on you." Dominic's voice was a low growl of possession. "You belong to me now. You're protected." The words broke the dam, and tears streamed down her face. A tiny noise from the doorway drew their attention. Lucas was there, clutching his bear, his eyes wide as he watched his father awkwardly hold the weeping woman. His small hands began to move with a slow purpose, shaping the signs she had shown him. "Ellie sad?" It was his first full question in 8 long months. A tearful laugh escaped Ellie as she knelt to his level. "A bit sad," she signed, "but it's okay now." The boy's gaze shifted to his father, then back to her, and his hands moved once more. "Daddy, help!" The air left Dominic's lungs as he knelt beside them. "Walk with me," Dominic said, his voice low. "There's something I need to say." Ellie followed him through the back doors and into the garden, leaving Lucas sleeping peacefully upstairs. A nightlight cast soft shadows across his face, Mr. Buttons tucked safely under his chin. For the first time in weeks, he had gone to bed without a fight, happily worn out from a day filled with learning and laughter. The quiet peace of the evening was a world away from the silent screams that had once filled this house. It was a peace that had been earned, built moment by moment on a foundation of shared understanding. And as they walked, their hands found each other, fingers intertwining not in a moment of chaos, but in the calm certainty of what they had become. They held on as if letting go would break something precious. Neither spoke, neither moved, neither let go. It had taken a shared crisis to get them here, a nightmare that had bound them together as they held a terrified little boy. Lucas had woken up screaming. No sound came from his throat, but his mouth was a wide O of terror, his body thrashing against invisible demons. Ellie had burst through the connecting door first, with Dominic just seconds behind. They reached him at the same time, gathering him into their arms. "Safe," Ellie signed against his back. "You are safe." "Daddy here," Dominic signed against his chest. Lucas clung to them, his small arms wrapping around both their necks, pulling them together over his shaking body until his breathing calmed and sleep reclaimed him. They remained there, frozen, their faces inches apart, their hands clasped over their son. That night solidified what had been growing for weeks. The small moments had been accumulating like snowflakes. Dominic draping a blanket over Ellie as she slept, her fingers lingering on his tie before a meeting, their hands brushing over a dish at dinner. The staff had seen it all. "First time in 8 months I've seen him smile," Vincent had murmured to Mrs. Crawford, watching Dominic laugh at something Ellie said. But before the staff noticed, and before the nightmare brought them together, there was the laughter. It had shattered 8 months of silence on a Tuesday evening. Ellie, teaching Lucas a new sign, had gotten flustered, mixing up the gestures for horse and duck into a ridiculous new creation. Lucas stared, his brow furrowed, and then his lips twitched. A tiny giggle escaped. Ellie froze. Dominic stopped breathing. Seeing their shocked faces, Lucas let loose a torrent of full, genuine laughter that filled the kitchen like sunshine. Tears streamed down Ellie's face as Dominic's hand found hers under the table, squeezing so hard it nearly hurt. It was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. The boy was still signing Ellie Silly when Catherine Castellano visited that weekend. She arrived expecting to find the same hollow mansion, but instead found her grandson running and laughing, signing excitedly to Ellie. "Grandmother," he signed, pulling her hand. "Ellie teach. Lucas talk now with hands." Catherine stared, her aristocratic composure masking a storm of emotions. The hostility toward Ellie was still there, but something else flickered in her eyes. "Perhaps," she said, her voice strained, "you have something the specialist did not." It was as close to an apology as she would ever get. And it was an acknowledgement that Ellie had succeeded where everyone else had failed, because she had uncovered the truth. The breakthrough had come not with a specialist's technique, but with a simple, heartbreaking conversation. Lucas, it turned out, hadn't just lost his mother. He believed he had been abandoned. "Mommy, Lucas, leave," he had signed, the words a punch to Ellie's gut. "Mommy, not love Lucas anymore." It all clicked into place. The months of silence, the emptiness in his eyes. He thought his mother had chosen to go. "No," Ellie signed back fiercely, taking his small hands. "No, sweetheart. Your mommy did not leave you. She was very, very sick. The sickness took her away." Yes. But his small hands insisted. "But she go leave Lucas. Leave Daddy." "She did not want to go," Ellie signed, pulling him onto her lap. "Your mommy loved you more than anything in the world." She pressed her hands against his small chest. "Sometimes, even when we love someone with our whole heart, we cannot stay." The tears he had held back for 8 long months finally fell. He buried his face in her shoulder, his little body trembling as his hands formed the words, "Mommy, love, Lucas." Ellie's heart ached. She remembered showing him the picture of her own daughter, trying to explain. "I had a daughter," she'd signed. "Her name was Lily." She'd shown him the photo, Lily laughing on a swing, and she'd explained that Lily's heart didn't work right, that she too had grown too weak to speak, but had used her hands to say, "I love you." It was then that Lucas made the devastating connection to his own mother. 3 floors above, Dominic had watched it all on a security monitor, his world collapsing. His son had spent 8 months believing he wasn't enough to make his mother stay. All this time, Dominic had been so lost in his own grief, he'd never once considered what poison might be growing in his little boy's mind. His hands shook, his vision blurred. "My fault," he whispered to the empty room, burying his face in his hands. "This is all my fault." The weight of that failure drove him to Lucas's room late that night. The boy was in bed, not quite asleep, his face cast in the soft glow of a nightlight. Dominic knelt down, and with clumsy, determined movements, he began to sign. "Daddy, love, Lucas." Lucas's eyes fluttered open. "Mommy, love, Lucas," Dominic continued. "Mommy, not leave. Mommy, always here," he signed, pressing a hand over his son's heart. In the darkness, Lucas stared at his father. Then, for the first time in 8 months, he reached out his small hand and touched Dominic's tear-streaked cheek. The gesture spoke volumes, bridging a chasm of unspoken grief. It was this moment of connection that changed everything. The silence that followed Isabella's death had been absolute, turning the grand mansion into a museum of sorrow. Dinners in the formal dining room were silent ordeals where every sound was swallowed by echoes. Dominic, lost in a fog of his own pain, had watched his son simply fade away. The boy who once filled the halls with noise had vanished, replaced by a ghost child with empty eyes, Mr. Buttons his only companion. The laughter was gone, the words were gone. There was only a crushing, suffocating quiet. It was a quiet that had defeated a parade of expensive specialists, each one leaving with a sympathetic shake of the head. For 8 long months, Dominic had done everything he thought he was supposed to do, trying to fix a wound he couldn't even see. He was a man drowning in failure, watching his son drift further away with each passing day. The mansion had become a tomb, and every silent corner screamed his wife's name. Desperate, out of options, and terrified of losing his son completely, he finally made a choice no one understood. He abandoned the specialists and their clinical approaches, and instead, he picked up the phone and hired a woman who taught a language of silence, hoping she could find a way into a world no one else could reach. Garden. A fragile quiet settled over them in the sanctuary of the garden. The cool night air was still, and the city's distant glow seemed a world away. Above, the Chicago sky was a vast expanse of black velvet sprinkled with stars. They sat on a stone bench under a massive oak, a shared silence stretching between them. Isabella adored this garden. Dominic finally broke the quiet, his voice a low rumble. She planted most of these flowers herself. She said our world had enough darkness and wanted something beautiful waiting for her at home. Ellie just listened, her hands still in her lap. When we met, this life had already claimed me. I had blood on my hands, a target on my back. I was sure I was past redemption. He looked up at the stars, pausing. But she saw something else in me. Underneath the brutality and the power, she saw a man who could be loved. She changed you, Ellie observed gently. She was the only light I had, his voice fractured. I swore I'd protect her. I built this entire empire for her, destroyed anyone who posed a threat. But the one enemy I couldn't fight was inside her, her own heart. A bitter laugh escaped him. I've crushed men with nothing but my hands. I've leveled entire criminal networks. But I was powerless to stop my wife's body from failing. The agony in his voice was a physical thing. Ellie gently placed her hand on his. I understand, she said, her tone full of a knowing sadness. More than you realize. Dominic turned to her, waiting. Marcus was Prince Charming when I first met him, she started, her voice unwavering despite the memories. He made me feel seen, wanted. After a childhood of being passed around foster homes, feeling like nobody's choice, he felt like a miracle. Her fingers tightened around his. The violence didn't start until after Lily was born. Little things, a hard shove, a quick slap. He was always sorry. He always swore it would be the last time. She took a shaky breath. And I always wanted to believe him. Why did you stay? He asked. Because I thought it was my fault, she confessed, tears finally escaping. I thought that's what love was supposed to feel like, and I had no one else, nowhere else to turn. Dominic's jaw was tight, his other hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist. When Lily got sick, he gambled away all our money. The savings I had scraped together for her surgery just vanished. And then when she passed away, while I was holding her in that sterile hospital room, he just disappeared. He left me buried in debt and grief. A heavy silence, thick with their shared histories of loss, hung between them. You deserved a better life, Dominic said, his voice laced with fury. You deserved so much more than you were given. So did you, Ellie countered, her eyes meeting his. Isabella would want to see you happy. She wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life lost in this guilt. How can you be so sure? Because if my Lily could see me now, my suffering would break her heart, Ellie replied, a sad smile touching her lips. The people we lose want us to live, even if they can't be here with us. Dominic shifted to face her, lifting a hand to her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. The announcement I made, he said, choosing his words with care, about marrying the person who got Lucas to speak. I intend to keep my word, but not out of a sense of duty. Ellie's breath hitched. Not because of some desperate promise, he went on, his voice dropping lower. But because The confession died in his throat. I didn't come here for a husband or for money, Ellie whispered. I came here for Lucas. But now, she said, leaning into his hand, now I'm staying for both of you. Dominic's gaze held hers. He gently tilted her chin up, bringing his face close to hers until their breaths mingled in the crisp night air. Their lips were just a moment away when a sound pierced the tranquility. A small, hoarse voice, unused after 8 long months of silence. "Daddy!" They both went rigid. It came again, louder this time, clear as a bell in the quiet night. "Daddy!" Dominic was moving before he could even think. Ellie was right beside him, their hearts hammering against their ribs in perfect time. That was Lucas's voice. They burst through the doors into the mansion's opulent foyer, the marble floors reflecting the light from the chandeliers. And there he was. At the very top of the grand staircase stood Lucas, clutching Mr. Buttons in one hand. Tears glittered on his cheeks as they streamed down his face. His little chest was heaving, his body trembling. "Daddy." The word was raw, gravelly, like a rusty hinge being forced open, but it was real. It was his son. Dominic stopped dead at the foot of the stairs. 8 months. 243 days of absolute silence. An army of doctors and specialists had all given up. And now, on a perfectly ordinary night, his son was talking. "Daddy, don't." Lucas held the banister, his knuckles pale from the strain. Every single word was a monumental effort, pulled from a throat that had forgotten its purpose. "Don't leave, Lucas." The plea struck Dominic with the force of a physical blow. He flew up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, stumbling in his frantic need to get to his son. He collapsed to his knees in front of Lucas, pulling his small frame into a desperate embrace, afraid he might crush him. "Never," Dominic sobbed, tears flowing freely. "I will never, ever leave you. Do you understand me? Never." Lucas wrapped his arms around his father's neck, his whole body shaking with sobs. But even through the tears, more words came spilling out. "Lucas scared," he said, his voice weaving through the hand signs he made against his father's shirt. "Daddy leave too, like Mommy." Dominic pulled back slightly, framing his son's face with his hands. He forced Lucas to look at him. "Why?" he asked, his voice shattering. "Why would you think Daddy would leave you?" Lucas's lower lip quivered. His hands kept signing as he spoke, the 2 forms of communication merging into one. "Daddy is sad all the time." His voice broke. "Daddy cries at night. Maybe Daddy wants to go to Mommy. Leave Lucas all alone." The truth hit Dominic like a punch to the gut. All those nights he thought his grief was a secret. All the moments he had broken down in private, thinking his son was oblivious. Lucas had seen it all, and in his child's mind, he'd mistaken his father's sorrow for a wish to die, to follow Isabella and abandon him. "No," Dominic said with fierce intensity, the tears carving paths down his face. "No, son. I was sad because I miss Mommy. My heart aches for her. But I would never leave you." He signed and spoke, his motions clumsy but earnest. "You are everything to me, Lucas. Mommy is gone, but I'm here. I will always stay with you." Lucas pressed his face into his father's chest, his shoulders shaking. "Promise?" Murmured into the fabric of Dominic's shirt. "Promise," Dominic replied, kissing the crown of his head. "I swear on my life." They knelt there on the landing, a father and son, shattered and slowly piecing themselves back together. Then Lucas looked up, his gaze finding Ellie at the bottom of the stairs. Her hand was covering her mouth as she cried silently. "Ellie," Lucas called, his voice gaining strength. "Ellie, stay too, right?" Ellie felt the air leave her lungs. Dominic turned, his eyes bloodshot and raw, looking at her. He didn't speak, but his question was the same as his son's. Both were waiting, hoping. She walked up the stairs, each step feeling momentous. Reaching them, she knelt and took Lucas's small hand in hers. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked him gently. Lucas nodded with so much force his whole body shook. Ellie is family. That one word, family, echoed in the vast space. It was the first time in 8 months he had defined his world, not with blood or obligation, but with love and choice. Ellie's tears fell without restraint. Now. Then I'll stay, she promised. For as long as you'll have me. Lucas threw his arms around her, pulling her into the embrace with his father. And so the three of them knelt on the grand staircase, a tangle of arms and tears and quiet laughter, holding on tight. Dominic's hand found Ellie's, their fingers locking together. In that moment, something new was born, a fragile, precious, and powerful thing. A family, not of blood, but of broken souls choosing to mend as one. Word of the Castellano boy spread through Chicago's underworld like a shockwave. The impossible had occurred. The mob boss's insane gamble had actually worked. But it wasn't some high-priced specialist who had performed the miracle. It was an unassuming housekeeper from the South Side, a woman with nothing to her name but a history of pain. 3 days after that night, Catherine arrived to see it for herself. She found Lucas in the playroom, chattering away to Ellie in his unique blend of speech and sign, excitedly showing her his drawings. The ghost of a boy was gone. That single moment changed the tide. Lucas started to open up, initiating conversation instead of waiting for her sessions. He would tug on her sleeve, his hands eagerly signing his wants. Apple, book, play. Soon, his requests turned into questions about the world. Why sky blue? Where birds go? Each one felt like a victory. But then came the one she never saw coming. During a lesson on feelings, his gaze locked onto hers with an unnerving intensity. His hands formed the words slowly. Ellie have child? And just like that, her world spun off its axis. The new trust between them led him, a week later, to a quiet hill overlooking the city, a cemetery. He led her to a specific headstone, Isabella Marie Castellano. I visit weekly, he admitted. Ellie knelt, her heart aching for the woman she once resented. You tried to help, she whispered to the marble. You cried for my daughter when I couldn't get her the care she needed. Beside her, Dominic knelt too. I read her journal, he said, his voice thick. She wrote about a baby with a bad heart, about a mother who pleaded for help. She wrote, I failed that little girl today. I cannot fail my own son the same way. This entire chain of events, the brutal justice, the unexpected healing, the boy finding his voice, was set in motion by a single morning. It all started when Ellie walked into the mansion, trying to conceal the damage with makeup. But there was no hiding the swelling around her eye or the cut on her lip. She moved with a pained stiffness, every step an effort. And then the summons came from a household guard. Mr. Castellano wants to see you in his study. In that moment, her stomach dropped, certain she was about to be fired, never knowing her pain had just ignited a war. The road. I will marry whoever can make Lucas speak, Ellie recalled his promise, her heart pounding. But I don't want you to agree out of a sense of duty. He met her gaze, his eyes full of a fierce yet gentle light. I want you to agree because... The words seemed to fail him. He never finished, but looking at him, she didn't need him to. This moment of pure connection was earned. Just 1 week before, Dominic had guided Ellie to a wing of the mansion she'd never seen before. They went down a hidden staircase behind the library, through a tight hall adorned with old family portraits, and stopped at a heavy oak door banded with iron. Where are we going? She had asked. He said nothing, simply swinging the door open. The chamber inside was stunning. It was a vast round room with a high vaulted ceiling and walls covered in dark velvet. A long table stood in the center, encircled by empty chairs. This was the nerve center of Chicago's underworld, where deals were struck and fates were sealed, where power shifted with a whisper or a drop of blood. But tonight, it was completely different. Hundreds of candles flickered everywhere, their light making shadows dance on the walls. The chairs had been moved to the perimeter. The table was empty, save for one document placed right in the middle. Dominic approached the table and lifted the paper. This is where I told everyone, he announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Right here, I stood before friends and foes alike and swore to give half of my empire to the person who could make my son talk again. Ellie watched him, her heart thumping in her chest. I was a broken man that night, desperate. I would have sworn anything. He glanced down at the document. This is the original vow, signed, witnessed, and legally airtight. He then pulled a lighter from his pocket. The flame licked at the paper's edge. Fire raced across the words, turning desperate promises into smoke, erasing a debt born from sorrow. Dominic dropped the burning paper into a metal bin, where it collapsed into ash. I don't need this anymore, he stated softly. Ellie's eyes shimmered in the candlelight. I never wanted your empire, she whispered, or your money, none of it. I know, Dominic replied, turning to her. On the rooftop terrace, a year after the wedding, Ellie rested a hand on her swollen stomach. 6 months along, the baby kicked enthusiastically whenever Lucas pressed his ear to her belly. I'm your big brother, he'd announce, his voice full of pride. This peace, this radiant joy, was something they had built together, piece by piece. But it hadn't been forged in a single moment. It was sealed a year earlier, in a garden blooming with white roses beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Surrounded by only their closest friends, they had exchanged vows that were more than just promises. They were testaments to how far they had come. I once believed my heart died with Isabella, Dominic had said, his voice thick with emotion as he held her hands. You brought light back into our darkness. Ellie's own tears had fallen freely. I thought I was broken beyond repair, she'd replied. You showed me that scars can heal. That day was a culmination of answered prayers. Lucas, beaming, had walked the aisle as the ring-bearer, Mr. Buttons tucked securely under his arm. Later, he had tugged on Ellie's dress, looked her in the eye, and spoken the word that shattered and rebuilt her heart all at once. Mommy. That single word was the true beginning of their family, a moment even more profound than the proposal that had preceded it by a month. In a room lit by flickering candlelight, Dominic had gotten down on one knee, not out of obligation, but out of a love that had quietly grown between them. He held out a simple diamond ring that sparkled like a captured star. I am doing this, he'd said, his voice trembling, because somewhere between your first day in this house and this moment, I fell in love with you. He told her she hadn't just saved his son. She had saved him too, teaching him that a broken heart could learn to beat again. He asked her to let him spend the rest of his life proving she deserved every happiness the world could offer. As tears of joy streamed down her face, her whispered yes was lost in a wave of laughter and relief. Then, as he slid the perfect-fitting ring onto her finger, the door opened. Lucas stood there, his eyes wide with hope, and when he learned the news, he launched himself into their arms, shouting a single, triumphant word, family! The joy of that moment was possible only because Dominic had finally let go of the past. Just before he knelt, he'd held up a formal document, a contract that had defined their relationship for months. It was a sterile agreement, a business arrangement born from grief and desperation. This, he had declared, holding it over a candle's flame, was a promise I made to a ghost. It was about gratitude and debt. The paper had curled, blackened, and turned to ash, severing the last tie to their formal beginnings. In its place, he offered a new promise, one not bound by ink, but by love. He was no longer a grieving employer honoring a deal. He was a man asking the woman he loved to be his wife. This vulnerability was something he'd learned from her, a lesson that began months earlier when they first bared their souls to each other under that same oak tree where they would one day marry. It was a trust she had earned by healing his son. The transformation in Lucas was the true miracle that started it all. The happy, chatty boy who now attended kindergarten with his friends was a world away from the silent child Ellie had first met. Back then, he was trapped in a world of grief, communicating only with a tattered teddy bear clutched in his hand. His little heart was broken, and his voice was lost. Dominic, consumed by his own pain and the darkness of his world, was desperate for anyone who could reach his son. And so, he had hired her. A nanny. A stranger walking into a house shrouded in sorrow, armed with little more than patience and a quiet understanding of loss. Their story didn't begin with a spark of romance or a loving glance. It began with a job interview and a contract, a father's last-ditch effort to hire someone, anyone, who could bring his son back from the silence. That was how it all started. Their movements were fluid and sure. Ellie mirrored them, her hands flowing in perfect time. Dominic joined in, his sign still a bit rough but packed with emotion. 3 sets of hands, telling a story of love to the sky. A profound silence then settled over them. It wasn't the silence of loss or emptiness. It was a silence of pure peace. Ellie looked at her husband, her stepson, and then her own belly, where a new life was beginning. She reflected on the path that led her here, the foster homes, the cruelty she'd endured, a failed marriage, Lily's passing, and the nights she almost surrendered. Then, she remembered the job posting that brought her to this estate, to this man, and to this shattered boy who had mended her heart as much as she had his. Sometimes, she murmured, the deepest pain brings the greatest love. Dominic heard. He reached across a sleeping Lucas and took her hand. I always thought that night was the worst of my life, he said in a low voice. The night I made that wild promise to the world, I thought I had finally shattered. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it softly. But really it was the night I was rescued. I just didn't realize it then. Lucas was fast asleep between them, his breathing quiet and steady, his face serene under the stars. Dominic and Ellie gazed at each other above their son's head. Words weren't necessary. Their hands met in the darkness, holding tight. High above, 2 stars outshone the others, sparkling as if in approval. Sometimes the deepest pain brings the greatest love. Sometimes losing everything teaches you to treasure what's left. And sometimes a family isn't about blood, but about souls choosing one another. Remember, when you can't find the words, love will always find a way. Did this story resonate with you? We'd be honored to read your thoughts in the comments. How did this journey make you feel? Did it bring up anything from your own experiences? Please let us know. We cherish every single comment and read them all with gratitude. If our story touched you, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next story. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that love is the ultimate healer. We wish you and everyone you care about good health, happiness, and tranquility in your lives. May each day be filled with moments of warmth and connection. Thanks for being with us. Farewell for now, and we'll see you again very soon. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.